Progressivism was a movement based on the idea that new ideas and honest, efficient government could bring about social justice. The progressive era began in 1890s and ended in 1920. It was a period of political reforms and social activism. Its main focus was to get rid of the corruptions in the government. The progressive movement mostly targeted those political machines and their bosses.
Many of the issues targeted for reform by the progressives were direct or indirect results of the great wave of immigration and industrialization around the turn of the century. In the single decade from 1900 to 1910, 8.8 million immigrants entered the United States, many of whom came from nations, ethnic groups, and religions that contrasted with the traditional dominance of American immigrants from the countries of Western Europe. They came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, as well as Asian locals such as Japan and China. Immigrants from southeastern Europe provided cheap labor to support the rapid growth of industrial center during the progressive era. The reality of the immigrant's life was far from the roads paved with gold that many envisioned. Industrial jobs paid low wages, demanded long hours, and offered no benefits or security.
Language, custom, religions, tradition brought to social conflicts and led to discriminations against the group of Asian Chinese on the West Coast and the Irish on the East Coast. The natives feared that the immigrants would have made it more competitive to get jobs, resulting in the lower of wages because new arrivals proved willing to work for a lesser pay. Therefore, the United States started to make restrictive law that became a barrier for immigrants.
Social reformers Jane Addams and journalist Jacob Riis were powerful voices for progressivism. They concentrated on exposing the evils of corporate greed, combating fear of immigrants, and urging Americans to think hard about what democracy meant. Other local leaders encouraged Americans to vote and fight against the government corruption and decided how each issue should be best addressed. Jane Addams founded the Hull House in Chicago. To the largely immigrant population living and working in the industrial neighborhood, Hull House offered kindergarten and daycare facilities for children of working mothers. It also offered an art gallery, libraries, music and art classes, and an employment bureau. Eventually, it turned into a network of influential reformer women who contributed a lot to progressiveness by starting programs toward fixing things like poor working conditions and low wages.
Jacob Riis was a reporter assigned to work in the slum of New York City. He actively advocated for and wanted the establishment of settlements, public playgrounds, public parks, etc. He was disgusted by what he saw in the slums and therefore did a lot of graphic reports on it. In 1890, Riis published his most famous work, How the Other Half Lives, a book that used revealing photojournalism and detailed analysis of the housing problems afflicting poor immigrants to argue in favor of reforming New York's tenements.
What were the successes and failures of the movement?
There were a number of attempts where the government tried to lower or stop the rate of immigrants coming to the United States because of those feeling threatened that their job would be taken. Also, they feel that they should maintain their racial purity.
The government set many laws to exclude the immigrants during the progressive era, such as Chinese Exclusion Act, approved on May 6, 1882, U.S. federal law prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers, signed by President Chester A. Arthur. It was the first federal law that prohibited entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. It placed new requirements on Chinese who had already entered the country. If they left the United States, they had to obtain certifications to re-enter. Although the Chinese composed only 0.002% of the nation's population, Congress passed the Exclusion Act to calm worker demands and relieve prevalent concerns about maintaining white racial purity. American experience with Chinese exclusion urged later movements for immigration restriction against other undesirable groups such as Middle Easterners, Hindu and East Indians, and the Japanese. The Chinese themselves remained ineligible for citizenship until 1943.
Gentleman's Agreement. It was an agreement between the United States and Japan in 1907 to 1908. A treaty with Japan in 1894 had assured free immigrations, but as the number of Japanese workers in California increased, they were met with growing hostility. On October 11, 1906, the San Francisco School Board arranged for all the Asian children to be placed in a segregated school. President Teddy Roosevelt summoned the San Francisco mayor and school board to the White House in February 1907 and persuaded them to cancel the segregation order. promising that the federal government would itself address the questions of immigrants. On February 24th, the gentleman's agreement with Japan was concluded in the form of Japanese notes agreeing to deny passport to laborers intending to enter the United States and recognize the United States right to exclude Japanese immigrants holding passport originally issued for other countries. A final Japanese noted date, February 18th, 1908, made the gentleman agreement fully effective. Dictionary of Races or People. It was a book claiming to consist of reports of immigration commissions in 1911. The entirety of this book focused on immigrants and different races that occupy areas at the time. Its reasoning for their appearance, intelligence, behavior, etc. can be seen as a racist book.
1924 Immigration Act. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. The legislation identified who could enter as a non-quota immigrant. This category involved wives and unmarried children under 18 years of age of U.S. citizens, residents of the Western Hemisphere, religious or academic professionals, and legal students under 15 years of age. Those not in any of these categories were referred to as a quota immigrant and were subject to annual numerical limitations. The establishment of a quota system limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, primarily Jewish and Slavic, while allowing significant immigration from Northern and Western Europe. Eugenics was wholly compatible with the progressive era's faith in science, the future, the regulatory potential of the state, and human perfectibility. The Immigration Restriction League was the first American entity associated officially with eugenics. Founded in 1894 by 3 recent Harvard University graduates, the League sought to bar what it considered inferior races from entering America and diluting what it saw as the superior American racial stock, upper-class Northerners of Anglo-Saxon heritage. They felt that social and sexual involvement with these less evolved and less civilized races would pose a biological threat to the American population. By 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court had accepted the progressive belief that the state ought to be empowered to determine who should and should not be permitted to reproduce. The political machines were important to immigrants both politically and in terms of welfare. The progressives disliked them because the political machines were corrupt. The progressives also felt that they gave too much power to immigrants who were often not well educated. Immigration throughout the progressive era did not really get any better, although they tried to do what they could to keep the numbers lowered. Even though they experienced tough times being far away from their homes and coming to a new place where they didn't know the language, immigrants did their best in bettering their lives in overcrowded cities and taking any work that came. I would say that during the progressive era, Americans were far more interested in advancing both in technology and economically for the better of the native citizens.
The contribution of new immigrants were life-changing to America's growth. It also changed the athletic diversity of the immigrants in America into a more multicultural society with varied language, traditions, and practice. The cultural contribution of the new immigrants can be seen in art, food, music, and culture of the modern America. However, today it seems as if we are slowly returning to the beginning.